Well, so Econ Salon is back again. That is what this particular program is called. And of course, as the name suggests, we are going to talk about economic issues in the main, macroeconomic issues to be precise, because that is what I lean towards and that is what will be of interest to the audience, I guess. Now, today's topic, of course, is very simply about about the budget for the forthcoming financial year, which will be 20 financial year 26-27. We are not going to be talking for an hour as we do on the other program, which is of course indigenization appreciation hour. We'll talk for less than that, and especially for this one, since I'm doing Econ Salon after quite a while. But before you guys chime in with your questions and stuff, and please do chime in with your questions and your comments. Let me just make a few remarks at the outset. So the thing is that budget 26, budget for financial year 20, sorry, not 26, 27, but financial year 25-26 has focused heavily on the consumer, as it were, as and on individual households as well, especially on the middle classes, particularly middle class households, maybe upper middle class households as well. And one of the most significant things that have been announced in this budget for the financial year 26, 25, 26, not 26, 27, is that there's going to be an tax cut for in various slabs. As you know the slabs, right? So basically, with and if standard deduction applies, you could well be tax free till around till an income of even 12,75,000, if you take into account the standard deduction as well, right? Given that given that the whole tax structure has been rejigged, it stands to reason that there is going to be an impact on the real economy in the subsequent quarters once this is of course implemented. So the question is, will the impact be of the kind that will lead to enhanced growth in the near and in the medium term as well? We won't talk about the long term per se, but we'll focus more on the near and medium term effects of this particular move. Now, the expected, the total, the tax cuts being given is expected to lead to an injection of about 1 lakh crores into the Indian economy or into the hands of the Indian consumer. Of course, not across the board, but among the tax paying public. Okay, it seems that the volume is very low. Let me try to fix that. I don't know why it is. The settings are pretty much the same. Is this better? Let me know if it's at all better. If the volume is at all better than before, let me know in the chat space. I'll try to speak louder also, of course, but the mic is right in front of my face. I don't. Okay, it is working better. All right, good. So, with that out of the way, let us now talk about, let's get back on topic. So, the injection is supposed to be to the tune of 1 lakh crores into the Indian economy as part of the new, once the new tax slabs are adopted by consumers across, by taxpayers, of course. And so the question is that, the question is whether this is going to lead to a major boost to GDP in the short run or not, right? On the face of it, it seems that it will, because I'll tell you why. Because if you put in 1 lakh crore into the economy, there is a multiplier effect. And the consumption multiplier is envisaged to be anywhere between 4 and 5. There will be leakages, of course. I mean, one leakage is, of course, that a part of it will be saved. So, but we are talking about the consumption multiplier here. So, we are only talking about the part that will actually be consumed, right? So, the question is whether, I'll take those questions. Some questions are coming in. I'll definitely go to those questions. So, the question is whether there's going to be a substantial boost to consumption itself or not. And if the consumption multiplier of 4 to 5 is taken at face value, and there are reasons why it can be taken, then of course 1 lakh crore should lead to an increase in output of about 5 lakh crores, right? If it is 5, between 4 lakh and 5 lakh crore. So at current exchange rates, that would be an increase in output of about $60 billion, right? Around $60 billion or so, maybe less. That I think is reasonable. A lot of people have dubbed this as a, as a sort of a sugary high or something that the government is trying to give the economy, but I don't see it that way. I think it was long overdue. Now, as far as like for instance, Devansh Kumar is asking, "Hi Saurav, was there a real FMCG slowdown? And was the consumer spending less? Was it that bad that the government had to step in? And when will the market stop reacting to Trump's tariff warnings?" I think it was becoming quite hairy, to be honest, because I had heard from people, I had been hearing about the demand slump from people across sectors, from people belonging to different sectors of the economy. Right, people in sales, not just in sectors like steel, which are definitely facing a slump due to cheap imports from China, etc., etc., but many other sectors as well, and FMCG was also one of them. So, see, you have to understand why we are where we are. If you remember, right, just prior to the pandemic, India's growth had slowed down considerably, and there was a lot of concern about demand. If you look at the last quarter of financial year 2019-2020, you will understand what I'm saying. In fact, not just the last quarter, the last 2 quarters of the financial year. Now, there is a reason why that happened. You see, demand destruction has been taking place for several years in India now. There is no denying that demonetization had a very distinct impact on the state of demand in India. One of the reasons why you did not see any kind of a wage price spiral in India even after injections were done later and etc., was because the labor market has been quite weak for the longest time. In the rural countryside, real wages have not just stagnated, they have fallen. Real wages have fallen elsewhere as well, because structural unemployment definitely increased in the last decade, and demonetization had a role to play in that, because a lot of companies, a lot of small firms which used to basically use cash to do most of their transactions, lending, borrowing, settlement, and anything, just went out of business altogether. That in turn had a big impact on employment, and structural employment increased, and that made labor markets much less tight than they used to be before. So there has been this definite demand destruction that has taken place. Then of course the implementation of GST also contributed to that, because a lot of firms which used to earlier compete by just being out of the GST bracket and informalize now could not anymore. That was, to be fair, that was always going on the cards. That's not something that had not been sort of programmed or had not been modeled. That was going to be the case. But remember that GST happened not too long after GST was implemented, not too long after demonetization. So there is that end. So, and it is also not surprising that uh, you know within about couple of years, a couple of years of demonetization happening, which happened in end 2016, you started seeing a decline in the growth rate, and you started seeing demand problems in the Indian economy. That is what is to be expected when you give a monetary shock in the way that in the way that demonetization was implemented, or in any case the fact of demonetization itself, I would say. So the Indian economy had been on a weakening trend. It was not getting stronger. And that is when the pandemic hit. And the pandemic, what it did was, the pandemic was basically a massive blow to the Indian economy, a much bigger blow than say demonetization was on the demand side, because as you if you remember, during the pandemic with the first lockdown, 120 million people actually lost their jobs overnight. Many of those jobs came back as the economy was reopened, and lockdown restrictions were removed, etc., etc., and all that. And But the fact is that a lot of demand destruction took place during the pandemic also. So the net result is that there is much greater structural employment in the Indian economy. The Indian economy is no longer on the old growth trajectory anymore that it was, which is why even hitting 6.5 or 6.6% growth is not proving to be so easy. The government is having to step in with stimulus measures. You see, what happens is what people don't need to understand is, suppose your economy is growing like this, is taking a path like this. This is the trajectory of your economy. When a big recessionary shock happens, there is a dip. Real business cycle says that you just with stimulus measures and say the economy getting back on its feet, you just go back to that old path and you resume your growth trajectory. But that is not what happens. Whenever there is a recessionary shock, there is a decline in the economic capabilities of a country, because firms go out of business. Firms going out of business means there is unemployment. There's greater unemployment than before. And the most important thing is there could be a loss in terms of the overall productivity of the economy's factors of production as well, when you take them together, what is called total factor productivity. All of this ends up putting you on a lower trend growth path than before, in the sense that you could hit the numbers of that upper trend growth path, but only at the risk of inflationary pressures showing up in your economy. And when those inflationary pressures show up, obviously the your central bank will act to dampen those inflationary pressures, because the RBI operates on an inflation target, right? It has a target of 4% CPI, consumer price inflation, within a plus minus 2% band of plus minus 2%. So the band is from 2% to 6% basically. As long as it remains here, it usually stays in neutral territory vis-a-vis its monetary policy. If it starts hitting the upper part of the band, it adopts a contractionary monetary policy. Even it tightens monetary policy. If it goes nearer the lower band, then it will of course then start giving monetary stimulus itself. So the fact that both the government and the RBI, and as you know, the RBI has also cut the benchmark rate by 25 basis points, right, by 0.25%. So both the fiscal authority and the monetary authority have decided to adopt stimulus measures, which means that price stability is not what they are concerned about. They're not concerned about inflation anymore. What they are seeing in the economy is weakening demand. And that is where things have been for a while, not just today. Which is why I keep stressing on the need for self-reliance and industrialization, etc. Because there is clear slack in labor markets, and and you must understand the worst thing that the pandemic did, which earlier shocks could not do, is the pandemic really ruined the balance sheets, household balance sheets. For instance, in India, we used to talk about the twin balance sheet problem with both firms and banks both having very weak balance sheets, which to a great extent has got remedied now. But households also have weak balance sheets in India right now. It's not like households have very strong balance sheets. Okay, so they are not really looking to load new loans onto themselves for spending on real estate, etc., or even to buy cars for that matter. Although, there's something paradoxical which has happened in the automobile market in India, automobile market, in that the consumers now want to buy those more expensive compact SUV type vehicles, much more than, as lighter sedans or hatchbacks. In fact, those are not the ones those segments aren't really growing anymore, if I'm not mistaken. It's that other segment which earlier used to be more of a premium segment, that is now becoming the more standard kind of purchase for middle class families. Anyway, that trend has been happening for a while, as we know. So, but the point is that in itself is also not a case for comfort. It only shows that the pandemic had a differential impact on the Indian economy, in the sense that anybody who was in a gated community and could work from home, right, actually may have ended up with a better balance sheet than before. But the number of such people is not that, no, not in the majority, obviously, by any stretch of imagination. It's a minority of people. Of course, I'm assuming that they survived the pandemic itself. There's an assumption right there. Okay, somebody's complaining about the sound again, but can you hear me? So, yeah, if you can hear me, then I'll just continue. Just let me know in the chat space whether you can hear me or not. So anyway, so with that in mind, what should have been our strategy? Our strategy obviously should have been to try and turn the consumption of those people into the jobs of other Indians. Right, which means, and now unfortunately, a lot of those people, the ones in the gated communities, also had a tendency to basically buy things which with a lot of import content in them, or imports directly purchased via, of course, any number of platforms now, especially Amazon. So that was the other problem. Why is this? Why do we keep screaming about indigenization, etc., etc.? Because as your economy's per capita income touches a certain point, the consumption basket undergoes a lot of change, especially for those segments which are better off. When you talk about a per capita income, you're talking about an average, right? So there are many people above it and there are many people below it also. So the success of the Indian economy will depend on whether it can tap the consumption of those classes in the next 10 years or so. So in one sense, so from the demand side, two things are things that we need to see, especially when we talk about this budget. There is definitely a injection which is being given to people maybe who don't always live in gated colonies, maybe people just in a segment below them but have to pay taxes nonetheless, are going to be benefited by it for certain. Now, what their marginal propensity to consume is, we need to see, although it is assumed to be nothing less than 0.7, right? For that is for every dollar that they earn, they are likely to basically, or rather, for at the macro level, for every one additional unit of output, they are likely to consume 0.7 units of it. Okay, those guys. So that is one segment that is being targeted via this tax cut. And the other segment is, of course, the upper echelon, the upper middle class, and of course the rich as well. We won't talk about the rich per se, because usually the rich have a much higher marginal propensity to save. It's just that because they are rich, their consumption basket turns out to be not insubstantial. But then now again, the proportion of such people is very much a small minority, right? A very, very small minority in the case of India. So there is this injection given. It will lead to greater consumption. Some of it will leak in the form of imports for sure. Some of it will also leak because will not lead to will not lead to the kind of increase in employment that you want, is because the value added of many of the things that people will buy in India is only about 15 to 20%. Okay, and let's talk about things like phones, or even and if you talk about other electronic items, it might be still lower, although increasing over time. So now that brings us to the other part of the question. We have to look at the sales side. Now we are talking more about the medium term rather than the short term. In the short term, this will definitely boost consumption, and I think a lot of people in the FMCG sector and other places are quite confident that this will not lead to savings, or investment in asset classes directly or anything, but this will be more focused on buying bread and butter stuff. So that is something we'll see. We'll see with that. We'll see how that goes. Now, in the medium term, if this multiplier has to, as time goes by, the multiplier effect also goes down. But if you want the multiplier effect to not go down to the extent that you want, there are things that have to be done on the supply side. We have to increase the value addition of whatever we produce in the Indian economy, the domestic value added, or whatever it is that is sold over here. That has to be an agenda. Okay, so import substitution over there. Now, what is being done right now is, because people have complained for the longest time that we have an inverted duty structure, and that our inputs are taxed, are heavily tariffed, whereas and there might even be some export tax on what we are trying to send out of here. So this budget has gone some distance in trying to change that as well, which is good, because just putting tariffs on some import is, say for instance, battery cells is not really the way to create domestic capacity in it. A much better, much more important, much better and much more sustainable way is to actually work on that sector, create linkages between industry and academia, and give subsidies at the right places. This is what the East Asians did, of course. Instead of just putting tariffs and expecting people to take advantage of that, and create and a supply, and expect that a supply chain will automatically stand up on Indian soil because of that. The East Asians, when we talk about the East Asian countries, they had a very different approach. They would focus on the thing itself. They would go down to the 6 to 8 digit level. They would link industry and R&D together. They would reverse engineer. They would do what it takes. This is something we need to do. And at the very least, we need to come out with that PLI scheme for components at the earliest, parts and components, because that will definitely contribute to the increase in value, to an increase in value addition on Indian soil, combined with the easy FDI policies, obviously. So that will be there. So that's definitely one thing we need to do on the supply side. Before I go on talking about all this, I might as well look at a few questions, because a lot of you have chimed in. So let's see what we have. I think I was answering Devansha's question till now. Ninad Dholakia asked, the overall expenditure hasn't increased, no, so not much difference in consumption, just the efficiency of consumption might increase. No, see, overall expenditure is when you talk about overall government expenditure, but what you're doing over here is you're giving a targeted break to certain classes of consumers who you think have a much higher marginal propensity to consume than others, right? And that is expected to give a boost to the Indian economy via multiplier effect. So that is what you're banking on. Okay, then Ninad Dholakia says the states hold the key to land, labor, edu and health. Have to find a way to read the riot act to them. I don't know what that would be though. Need sticks, not just carrots. Same goes true for municipal governments. Yeah, you see, as you go further and further down the chain, there is no doubt that governance in India becomes much weaker. I mean, municipal governance is non-existent even in many big cities. The state of affairs with respect to garbage collection, waste collection, maintenance of drainage systems, etc., is a proof of that, I guess. But even then, land acquisition is not as much of a problem today as it was, say, 15 years ago. And education and health are more long-term things. Obviously, you have to invest in social capital for longer-term growth. But if we talk about the near to medium term, there are any number of things that the central government can do to at least hit that 6.5% growth mark. Because unlike what people think, the potential growth rate of India is not anywhere near 7 or 8%. Those days are gone. India will have to invest heavily in, basically the investment cycle itself has to kick off before we get to a position where we start, we can sustain those kinds of growth rates without inflation rearing its head. See, the Indian economy has been in a trough since 2013, right? 2012, in terms of private investment. Private investment has been in a trough. And the private investment cycle has never seen a sustained uptick since then. Every time there is somewhat of an uptick with capacity utilization going up, simultaneously people think, oh, this is when when things are going to turn around, but it doesn't happen. In fact, that's the other thing. The other reason why this sugary rush, as some people want to call it, although I won't call it that, is also required, is so that capacity utilization does not, again start falling towards that 70% mark in different industries. Because it had reached a peak of 76.2 months some quarters ago. But after that, again you're seeing the same, especially sectors like steel are in trouble anyway. But again, you're seeing the same kind of slump that you've seen in the past. And till such time that capacity utilization really increases, you are not going to come out of this investment trough that you are in at the moment. The investment trough that India is in. Capacity utilization is a key part of that puzzle. Another part of that puzzle is, of course, exports. It has been found in empirical studies that investment in private investment in India and exports are, positively linked to each other. I mean, there is grandeur causality from exports onto in private investment. So those are two things that need to be focused on. But to achieve success, of course, in on the export side, of course, you need two or three things. One is you need the East Asian approach, where you assiduously build the supply chain. You have armies of bureaucrats who focus on building the supply chain, work very closely as intermediaries, bringing together industry and academia to increase the value added of whatever you are making. The other is, of course, entering into some kind of free trade agreement with key partners. That is the other way, not with China, because that will have the very opposite effect. I mean, and in the case of China, we want not entering into an FTA means not signing RCEP basically, because that is a de facto FTA with China then. But an FTA or even a limited deal with the United States and of course Europe definitely needs to be explored, and that will be another push factor for for the investment cycle to resume in India. Now, another thing that I must say over here is that by focusing on the consumer, the right decision has been taken by on individual consumers. Tax rates for Indian industry have already been rationalized to a great extent. I mean, corporate tax rates. Okay, it is Indian industry cannot keep asking for more and more incentives when when it is not really investing, and it is not even passing on any share of the profits onto its employees. That is the other problem. But that the fact that it is not doing that shows that the labor market is quite slack. Ultimately, bargaining power for labor can only come from the labor market not being slack. So so we circle back to that whole structural unemployment thing that I outlined right at the outset, which has definitely increased. Okay, so now Rishikesh Roy says Indian banks need to be given the power to create credit and lend money with the government giving window guidance as the Japanese did. Why RBI not cutting? The RBI has cut. It also, see, the RBI also has to be on a wait and watch mode. What is the RBI's main mandate? Price stability while keeping an eye on growth. Okay, and the two are not at odds with each other. These are not mutually exclusive things, but obviously price stability is the main thing, and the operation of the payment system in the economy. These are the two main objectives for the RBI to pursue. Now the thing is, the RBI has cut the benchmark rate, and the thing is, you may see larger cuts in the offing depending on what trajectory American monetary policy takes. I mean, on what the Federal Reserve of the United States does. Because see, in an open economy setup, cutting interest rate also means contributing to the outflow of money from your economy, and that in turn has puts pressure on the exchange rate, which we are seeing anyway, right? And because there is pressure on the exchange rate, there will be some pass through onto domestic inflation, which is what you don't want. Although that pass through effect has gone down over the years for a number of reasons, which we can discuss in some other Econ Salon program or episode. So the thing is that there is always, in an open economy, you don't only look at one variable when you are setting the interest rate, or when you are talking about easing monetary policy. The exchange rate is something that you always look at, especially in India, which doesn't have a freely floating exchange rate. Okay, we have a dirty float. We basically do manage it and keep it at a certain level, and which is why for a long time there was this talk, I mean till a few months ago, that India had a de facto peg to the dollar, that the RBI was not allowing the rupee to move at all vis-a-vis the dollar. Anyway, that aside, as far as directed lending is concerned, window guidance, we have done this since independence, by the way. Okay, it's not like we haven't done it, but we should not move to the main bank kind of system that the Japanese used to have, especially during the era of the Zaibatsu and even later, where you basically have an interlocking web of companies with a bank at the center of it giving loans to those companies. You should not move to that model at all. In any case, India has been straddled with problems related to what are called policy loans, right, forever, which is how we ended up with the twin balance sheet problem anyway. So now that we've got out of it, we need to maintain, we need to keep in mind the best practices as far as our commercial lending sector is concerned. Okay. In fact, some easing is already happening. And that easing has been done by the RBI for NBFCs. It is not being as stringent as it said it would be on NBFCs. Because after ILNFS collapsed, the whole idea was that a prompt corrective action framework would be implemented for NBFCs also, not just for commercial banks. So that is there anyway. But the thing is that, but the issue is not that. Money growth in an economy is contingent on the demand for it. The demand for money increases when you are actually in an environment of growth, which we are in. We are obviously still growing at 6% plus, but we are not really going to be able to grow at 7 or 8% with the kind of economic setup we have at the moment. We have to industrialize. We have to increase the economic capabilities of India. And for that, a whole bunch of things have to be done. And that is where very smart protectionism has to be done. Just some tariff somewhere is not that. It has to be done at a very much more granular level for it to work. For instance, the talk has been for the last 20 years how China needs to rebalance towards consumption from being an investment driven export led economy, right? Whereas in the case of India actually has to rebalance towards investment and towards manufacturing from services to an extent, both services and agriculture, because we are very far away from that goal of reaching 25% of our from reaching manufacturing value added, which is equal to 25% of total value added. We are very far away from that goal even now, and this is our last window because the new tariff war, the new trade war has started, and this is the time when India has to make its move. Actually, the window has been open for the past few years, but it may shut rapidly. So it is time that we moved much more and much more effectively on the supply side in the way that I described. Not merely in terms of tweaking a tariff here or tweaking a tariff there and expecting the supply chain to come up because firms will automatically invest. It won't happen like that. There has to be much more groundwork and legwork done for that to happen. And that is the key learning that we should have from the economies in East Asia. There are many things that we shouldn't learn from them, which I have talked about in previous Econ salons, but this is something we should learn from them. Okay, Devdeep Mukherjee asks, Uncle Sam trying to do something with Checoms. It is already doing that. But remember one thing, this great Trump and his regime, they believe in the art of the deal. So the whole idea is a shakedown. If you remember, even in 2020, they had arrived at a preliminary deal, 2019-2020, the Americans and the Chinese. So keep that in mind when you look at the trade war, but there is definitely scope for us to gain from it. We have to enter into some kind of a limited agreement, if not a full-blown arrangement with the Americans on the trade side. Right, so that is there. Okay. Ninad Dholake says everyone says 2 out of 6% inflation is due to food, which is seasonal, and monetary levers don't work as effectively. It's not as if RBI wouldn't know this. Why they extend high rates and baffling? No, unfortunately, what does it see? Typically, the world over, they target core inflation, stripped of both energy and food prices, because these are considered volatile, as you are pointing out. But in India, food prices have been found correlated with prices in the rest of the basket, which is why they have never dropped food from the CPI basket that they are targeting. Okay, this targeting of a core is still a matter of debate in India. Now, as far as the issue of tax cuts rate cuts is concerned, I think you'll see more rate cuts in the coming 4-5 quarters itself. Okay, and then Akshay, Russia-Ukraine war too impacted household balance sheet. Yeah, of course it did, because there was a massive, the pandemic gave an inflationary boost, and then there was a subsequent, there was more supply side inflation and imported inflation due to the Russo-Ukraine war. It definitely did that. Okay, so people are asking me about the Semicon mission doing. Semicon mission, once Look, let's see when the first chips start coming out and what kind of a market they find before we comment on the semicon mission. And I'm talking not just about the ATMP plants. Okay, I'm talking about the ones which are making wafers as well, which will make wafers. So let's see how that goes. Tata is of course going to be at the forefront of both. Okay, I'm not answering these Kaveri type questions right now because these are reserved for IAH. Okay. Good news about indigenization to counter the sickening striker purchase. Yeah, unfortunately, that striker purchase seems to be on the anvil. Okay, Siddharth Singh, what about MSME? How are we going to give them credit? So this is where that whole directed lending comes in, right? For the longest time in India, there used to be this thing called core sector lending. So core sector lending has to be done, and the bedrock of your industrial estate will be the MSMEs only, will be the MSME sector. So core lending and priority sector lending, it was also called priority sector lending, not core sector lending. Core, of course, refers to the core sectors of the economy. Forgive me for that. I meant priority sector lending. So priority sector lending has been done since independence. It has to be resumed. There has to be some, basically but MSMEs don't just need priority sector lending, whereas cheaper credit will definitely help them. What they also need is hand holding for them to understand. This is where I cannot emphasize enough that a lot of work has to be done at the ground level to change the face of the industrial estate in India. It will not happen by itself. If you go to the government, they will say, oh, I'm giving this, I gave mudra loans, I gave this, I gave that. But the sum total, the sum of the effects, the sum of the parts is actually less than what you would imagine it to be. It will not be like that. You need a granular approach that looks at the actual production of the thing. That has to be done. There's no other way. That is the way to build up an industrial estate. Okay, so somebody is asking, Bishojit Panda asking, sir, don't you think there should be regulations for fiscal discipline of states like inflation targeting? What is your opinion? No, so there has to be fiscal discipline of states. Actually, what you need is a fiscal council, so that these center state, the center state friction can also be sort of dealt with on the fiscal front. And you definitely need new standards for fiscal management being implemented across states. There are these fiscal sustainability indices which are already there, which are but compiled by the central government agencies only. But you need to enter into a very different kind of an arrangement, and that arrangement has to be overseen by a fiscal council which has to be set up. It is time to set up a fiscal council. In fact, I'll talk about what a fiscal council does and what it can do in another episode, because like I said, this is not indigenization appreciation hour. This won't go on for an hour. In fact, I'll now have to wrap this up. So let me just take the final few questions. Senbaga Muthu Rahul asks, which private company do you think will take the nuclear power plant leap in India? The Tata is obviously Tata Power, and Tata Steel will actually locate the first captive units of will locate the first Bharat small reactors, which are re-engineered IPHWR 220s. At a plant, at an existing plant, where it will replace the coal-fired units. Okay, Senbaga also asks, why still an issue with, this is a defense related question, so won't get into it. Rishikesh Roy says, oil to $60, refineries will get hit. We have destroyed our automobile sector with higher GST. Opinion of GST rationalization has to be done yesterday. You cannot have a 4 or 5 speed GST, and you cannot have entire sectors out of the GST ambit altogether. See, a typical problem that happens is, suppose I am selling XYZ and the rate of GST applicable for me is 12%, whereas my most important inputs are taxed at 18%, IGST plus SCGST. Obviously, that is not going to help me, right? It's the very opposite of what will help me. In places like Singapore, you have a single GST rate. So that what I pay, I pass on. As simple as that. Who's going to absorb the slack over here? The only way in which the only thing that can happen here is the prices will increase. That's what will happen. because the prices will have to be marked up to take care of the GST outgo on inputs, right? And which is why GST can have an inflationary impact also on the economy. The one of the reasons why GST did not have the kind of inflationary impact you saw on the economy is because a few months prior to that, demonetization was done, which had a huge deflationary impact on the economy. So GST could not really lead to the kind of problem that I outlined, because firms were in no position to pass on price hikes onto consumers for the longest period. You saw a burst of inflation after the pandemic precisely because there was some pent up demand and there were some freebies also that were given, and that way firms could maybe pass on some firm hikes than before. But even then, inflation did not really take hold in the Indian economy, and now you're going to see the opposite. You're going to see the CPI fall close to not just 4% but even below that, which is why these both fiscal and monetary stimulus measures are now being adapted, but of course with a wait and watch approach because of the whole open economy conundrum. You have to keep an eye on the exchange rate and obviously capital outflows in general, right? Okay, so Siddharth Singh is saying MSME can compete with Chinese import if we give them support credit, etc. Yes, they can. They are the ones who can compete. In fact, many of them used to compete when they were completely informalized. Because they were informalized, they didn't have many overheads, they didn't have many compliances to take care of. They used to compete that way and generate employment as well. But of course, that was not an optimal situation. You want to formalize your economy for any number of reasons, but that is what it was. And now many of them are not in business anymore. So you see the number of people who have joined the services sector has increased. And by services, I mean basically being hawkers on the streets of major Indian cities. Anyway, so CDAC is running a year behind schedule in their plans. What is the reason, and will we see a successor to the Shakti processor? CDAC is running behind. Again, this is sort of an IH question only. CDAC is because they were not given a sanction. They were not really given the go-ahead to use the ARM processor for the exascale system till recently, which they have now. So I guess you will see a exascale system, indigenous exascale system, although the processor itself can't be fabricated in India. It uses 5 nanometer node technology. But you will see the exascale supercomputer with all interconnects and memory and the servers and etc. all, and obviously the operating system all done over here. You'll see that in less than 2 years, I think. Anyway, what about PLI for MSMEs? Why government support only big business? Why no EMD rebate for all tenders, even for state tenders? This is a very good question, actually. EMD is the bane of Indian government procurement. Okay, this cannot be stated enough. It has to be changed. The way government, way various arms of the government bring out tenders, and the nature of those tenders itself needs to be fixed and needs to be made much more MSME friendly. There's no doubt about that. This way, government consumption will not leak abroad and into select few hands, but will actually spread, the multiply, and will basically spread the fruits of public spending over a much wider base. Senbaga Muthunaulas, do you think infrastructure will still be the way forward for the third term of Modi government? See, infrastructure investments will have to continue. Another reason why you see the sort of the growth rate dipping is because of the elections. A lot of infrastructure spend had to be withheld. A lot of capex because of code of conduct and other considerations. So that will have to continue, because one of the things that you would need to compete on the export front, which in turn will be linked to investment, which in turn will be linked to industrial growth, which in turn is linked to obviously good value, well-paying jobs for a mass of people, is contingent on infrastructure. Because typically when you talk to anybody in the electronic sector or anything, they talk about disabilities. They say that we have a 9% disability vis-a-vis China. That basically their stuff is 9% cheaper than ours. Or maybe the other way around, although then the percentage is the amount, the quantum, the exact quantum will not be will not be the same. If you say that it is 9% greater than them or theirs is 9% less than them, that's not the same thing. Okay, so having said that, because that is 1.09 and that is 0.91. Anyway, let me not digress into something as strange as this, but the point is that you will not be able to remove that disability unless you invest in infrastructure, and the right kind of infrastructure, the right kind of road infrastructure with the right kind of linkages, industrial parks which are truly plug and play, and plug and play in terms of both, utility connections, waste management, everything. And also the governance of the industrial park has to be pretty simple. You have to fix all of those things. So, but those things will ultimately in the immediate benefit more of the end processing sector only. If you want value added to increase, which is required for sustained industrialization, you will have to again adopt the granular approach that I've mentioned a few times during the course of this program. Siddharth Singh asks, what about reforms in education sector, university level education? Well, that's the whole thing. Now, not just reforms. I think more important is investment in social capital, because that has a direct bearing on long term growth. But I am more focused on the near to medium term as far as this episode is concerned. Rishikesh Roy says, the impact of ML and friendshoring on its coolie companies. Hope DeepSeek has given them an awakening. We need our LLMs. Low code platforms will affect our mass recruiters. Yes, we definitely need LLMs, and I think the entry barriers for LLMs are going down all the time. The old reasoning does not work anymore. You definitely need your LLMs. You need to create IP. What you really need is what is called innovation based import substitution and innovation based export promotion. You have to create products which are better and cheaper, or invent new lines of products altogether. Right? This is how industrialization actually progressed everywhere. In China, you're seeing that now. China is not just a copy master anymore. They're coming up with new products themselves, which they are in a position to produce now because they've built up their industrial estate. And that you're seeing in the military as well now. They're fully leveraging their overcapacity to churn out things very quickly. So there is no alternative to just getting down there, getting dirty, and getting and doing it. This has to be the mantra that we sort of adopt going forward. Okay, having said that, I think at the risk of sounding redundant, I'll now have to call it a night. I must say that I wasn't as prepared for this program as I should have been, because there's a lot going on. In programs of the future Econ Salon episodes, I'll have charts and graphs ready and a more structured narrative than the one that I sort of unfolded over here, or put forth before you on this episode. So do forgive me for that, but keep tuning in, because because this is going to become more and more intense over time. I'm going to explain many things, many difficult macroeconomic concepts quite simply in future episodes, so that people have an overall view of what is going on, and I will answer all your questions as well. But for now, I think I'll have to call it a night. As always, thank you for tuning in, and Jai Hind.